Hello and welcome back. This is the week 2 lecture. So today I would like to talk about Frankenstein, the book that we are hopefully working our way through. And remember, we're doing this because in our textbook, they use Frankenstein along with those other 5 texts that I mentioned last week. They use them as like sample texts to analyze in each chapter as they are demonstrating how to utilize these different critical approaches. So when you're showing people how to use a critical approach to literature, it helps if you actually have a work of literature to apply the criticism to. So they're using Frankenstein along with Huck Finn, Hamlet, To His Coy Mistress, Young Goodman Brown, in everyday use as those 6 sample texts that they can analyze, throughout the book. So as I said in week 1, we don't have time to try to read all 6 of those texts. We certainly can't get through Hamlet and in addition to these multiple novels. So I'm scaling it back and I'm really just hoping that we can read Frankenstein and the poem To His Coy Mistress. If we can also get to Young Goodman Brown, the short story that I also posted to the week 1 module, that would be great. I would be thrilled if we could also read Young Goodman Brown, but that's more optional, and the other 3 are definitely optional, and I haven't even posted those to the week 1 module or anywhere else in Canvas because I don't want to overwhelm you guys. But of course, if you want to check those texts out, you can. And if you're having trouble finding them, let me know and I can try to find free versions online to link you to. But I thought we would have plenty to do if we just tackled Frankenstein and the poem To His Coy Mistress. So my goal is to really be finished with these works of literature by next week. I know I said initially that I wanted everybody to finish Frankenstein by the end of week 2, but really we can talk about it more next week in week 3, and we can wrap it up in week 3. I'll also talk about the poem next week, and we can briefly discuss Young Goodman Brown for those of you who were able to read it. But once we have these texts sort of filed away, once we have read these works of literature, we'll be ready to jump back into the textbook and start learning more about the specific critical approaches that the book is really all about. So hopefully the schedule makes sense. I know it might feel a little bit strange, and I know it's rather challenging to jump directly into a novel like Frankenstein. As I mentioned last week, it's not a terribly long novel. So some people find it to be pretty exciting, a pretty quick read, but I did warn you guys about the rather difficult language. The book was written in 1818. Well, it's published in 1818, written probably a couple of years prior to that. So it is well over 200 years old. So obviously the language is different. It can be difficult for modern readers, and really all the characters talk in a highly formal, sort of old-fashioned way that might not sound very familiar to our ears. But if you stick with the book, if you keep reading, you will get used to the diction. You'll get used to the way the characters talk. You'll get used to Shelley's style, which might feel a little bit strange at first, but yeah, you'll adjust to it as you read on. And as you start to get sort of acclimated to her sentence structure, her word choice, and also the way she's building her narrative. One thing that's cool about this book, or at least what I think is interesting for us, is it's a story that we know very well. But for many of us, our experience with Frankenstein might be based more on the movies that we've seen, or maybe television adaptations. This is one of these stories, one of these works of literature that started out as one thing, but it has been adapted and sort of altered to fit many other forms of media, as we probably know. So it starts out as a novel, but now in 2025, we might know it as a movie or a comic or some other type of writing, some other type of literature, or even some other type of media that might be totally different than a novel. That's always an interesting process to observe because the story will change as it gets adapted to other media, to other forms of art. So a lot of us might think of Frankenstein in a particular way. We might think that we already know the story, even if, and we probably do, generally speaking, even if we haven't read the novel. But part of what we can do over these next couple of weeks is perhaps reevaluate our assumptions about this story. We might need to reevaluate the way we feel about the monster. We might also not want to call the creature a monster. There's some other options. And as we're going to learn today, the way the monster is often portrayed in movies is quite different than the way, at least in certain respects, is quite different from how the monster is portrayed in the novel. And even just in the way that we use the name. You know, in popular culture, we often use the name Frankenstein to refer to the monster, right? And if you've ever dressed up as Frankenstein for Halloween, or if you've ever been sort of exposed to this stuff on a sort of kids entertainment level, this is certainly true. But it's even kind of a shorthand that grown-ups use when they talk about the story, right? When they say Frankenstein, they often mean the monster. But of course, as we see as we're reading, Frankenstein is the name of the scientist, the name of the man who created the monster. So Frankenstein is really Victor Frankenstein, who is a human. He is a normal human, at least at the beginning of the novel. He is a human driven to discover new things. He's a scientist. He wants to discover new sources of knowledge. He wants to be able to do things and know things that were previously impossible for people to even approach. So he's a very ambitious man. He's a very intelligent man, somewhat charismatic, maybe, although I'm not sure that that really comes across in the book. But he's a sort of impressive person who descends into something resembling madness because he creates this creature and then he quickly realizes that he's repulsed by the creature and he can't control the creature in perhaps the ways that he imagined. So he creates something that is impressive and scientifically, technologically innovative, but he doesn't consider the risks. He doesn't consider the downside. He becomes sort of drunk with his ambition and his quest, his thirst for knowledge. It kind of overwhelms him and it leads him to making some poor decisions. And we might decide that we don't find him terribly sympathetic all the time, the way we might expect to find the protagonist of a famous story. And the monster might not be quite as villainous as we often assume it to be based on maybe movie adaptations. The monster is kind of wounded. The monster is a victim in some ways. And even though the monster commits some pretty heinous crimes of its own, there might be some reasons for that. And in many ways, Victor abandons his creation almost immediately, right? So we have to reckon with all of that. It's a rather complex narrative, at least on the level of like psychology and character motivations. It's not cut and dry. Victor's not necessarily a hero. The monster is not necessarily a villain. There's lots of shades of gray that we'll see as we read on. So we can reevaluate some of our assumptions about this story, and we can also just appreciate a great work of literature. We might not always love reading it, but we should appreciate a lot of what Mary Shelley is doing here. So I wanted to share with you guys a little bit of a critical response written by this guy, Harold Bloom, who's a very important, sort of preeminent American literary critic. So he did the kind of work that we are sort of emulating with our own work in this class. He was a literary critic, which meant that he wrote scholarship, academic writing about literature. So he reviewed books, but he did more than that. He wrote theory, he wrote analysis, he wrote interpretations, he wrote stuff that could be used by students when they were reading those works of literature. He was providing frameworks for interpretation and analysis, and he was, writing criticism of the literature that would be very helpful for students, scholars of the literature, or anybody else who might be interested. So we always want to draw a firm line between the literature itself, written by authors like Mary Shelley, and the literary criticism about the literature, written by the likes of Harold Bloom. Many literary critics were also literary scholars, which meant that many of them, like Bloom, taught at very prestigious American universities, and they taught English classes, they taught literature classes, and they also wrote about literature. Some of those guys wrote literature themselves, but they were wearing a different hat when they did that. As critics, they were commenting on the literature, not writing literature, right? They were evaluating literature, analyzing it, interpreting it, explaining parts of it, talking about why it's significant. Again, great resources for students and other scholars, the people who normally use literary criticism. But people like Bloom are often the ones producing literary criticism. They teach at universities, they teach these great works of literature, they're experts on the works, and they also write about them, often in academic journals, or they publish books. Bloom has many of both. So Bloom has an interesting way of sort of introducing the book, and again, he's encouraging people to reevaluate what they know about this story. So I just want to read a little bit of this. I'm not going to read it word for word. I'm just sort of paraphrasing him. So he calls the novel an early example of science fiction. And that might be an interesting way for you guys to think about it. If any of you are sci-fi or fantasy fans, you might see some stuff in here that you can recognize, or you might be able to see how this book helped to influence future works of sci-fi or fantasy. So we can think of it that way. It's also a scary story, right? It is a horror story. And that's often the way it's packaged in its many adaptations. This is often a story used for fear, to scare people, to be thrilling and frightening. So that's definitely at work as well. But Bloom wants to make sure that we know the full title of the book. It does not usually appear on the cover, but the full title of Shelley's novel is Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus. And for Bloom, that the rest of the title, that little subtitle, The Modern Prometheus, is important, because he claims that Victor Frankenstein is very much like the figure Prometheus. Some of you might know this figure. He comes from Greek mythology. He's actually a Titan in Greek mythology, a race that I think predates the gods, or they're different than the gods. They're often fighting with the gods. Anyway, we don't need to be an expert on Prometheus, but what he does, what's famous and what gets written about a lot, both in Greek mythology and later, is Prometheus steals fire from the gods, and he then shares it with regular humans, and the gods very much did not want him to do that. So Zeus ends up punishing him for that action, and I believe the punishment is he's like chained to a boulder, or like he's on some mountain and he can't leave, and every day an eagle, I'm probably getting some of this wrong, I'm no expert on Greek mythology, but some kind of bird, I want to say it's an eagle, comes and eats his liver every day. But the gods are able to make it so that his liver grows back. This is obviously not a realistic story. It's mythology. The liver grows back each day so the eagle can come back and eat it again. So that's the punishment for Prometheus. That's how he's punished by the gods after he steals fire and shares it with humans. So the fire is often thought to represent a lot of things. Like a lot of authors like Bloom will claim that the fire represents like technology, science, innovation, even artistic advancement. It's basically just this idea that humans are able to move their civilization forward forward because of this thing. Humans are able to advance and do new things because of this new invention or this new innovation that has been shared with them. So you can take it literally, but a lot of people also kind of take it to represent this idea that Prometheus was helping humans to kind of advance and become more powerful, and the gods didn't want that. So Bloom sees in Frankenstein a kind of more modern version of Prometheus. He's trying to acquire forbidden knowledge. He's trying to do things that maybe violate like the rules of nature in certain respects. So the world that we inhabit here is not a world of ancient Greece with the gods and stuff, but a lot of people think that where he goes wrong is that he violates laws of nature and he tries to play God. He tries to take on a level of responsibility and power that many think no humans should ever assume or try to take hold of. So that's perhaps where he goes wrong. He wants too much knowledge. He wants too much power, and it sort of leads him down this dark path of ultimately creating a creature that he cannot control. So again, Bloom goes to great lengths to say that maybe we should not call the monster, right? He says we instinctively refer to the creature as the monster because we have seen so many motion picture versions of Frankenstein. And he says, despite his crimes, the creature is actually as much an angel as he is a monster. And we do best by following the book in calling him the demon. So he's arguing that this is a better word to use because it's the word that Shelley often uses in the book when she refers to the creature. And we don't mean demon in the sense of like an evil sort of creature from the underworld, although we can be talking about that. But this is actually an older definition of demon that Shelley was probably working with. And again, it really goes back to ancient Greece. In ancient Greece, the word referred to a divinity, like a supernatural spirit or a supernatural figure that existed somewhere between the gods and regular humans. So Bloom argues that's a better way to think of the creature. We shouldn't think of it as a monster because then we have like a prejudice against it, right? We don't typically like monsters. We reject monsters. Monsters are bad. Monsters are scary. And of course, the creature is very scary to look at. Almost everybody he encounters, they're scared. They run away from him, right? Because he's sort of, frightening in appearance, the way he's been assembled, right? He is a frightful appearance, but that doesn't really tell the whole story. He's actually not all bad. He's very curious. He's very innocent at first, right? As he learns more about humans, he learns how mean humans can often be because he's often mistreated. And yes, he commits some crimes, as Bloom mentions, as the narrative progresses, but largely he does that because he's desperate, because he's alone, because he's rejected, and he's really given no access to human love or kindness. Every time he seeks it out, it's denied him. For various ways. So he starts to get angry, right? He starts to get angry about his situation. And obviously he's very angry at Victor for putting him on Earth in this very difficult spot. So Bloom just wants us to think about that stuff. And he also goes into a lot of detail about Mary Shelley's biography. I'm not going to get into a ton of that today just because we don't really have time, but she is a very interesting individual, an interesting writer, but also just an interesting person. So if you like the book, if you're interested in her writing style or her background, I would recommend looking into it a bit more and conducting some more research. So you guys might know that Mary Shelley was married to a pretty famous poet, Percy Shelley, and obviously she took his name upon marriage. But she came from a very illustrious family, so it wasn't just that she had a famous husband. who also died in kind of a famous, tragic way when, not long after they got married. But she also had pretty famous parents. So I'll just mention this in passing, and you guys can dig into it more if you're interested. But her mother was considered sort of an early feminist and a pretty influential writer in the late 1700s into the early 1800s, named Mary Wollstonecraft. So she wrote a famous essay called The Vindication of the Rights of Woman, which came out in 1792. And a lot of scholars would argue that that's kind of an early example of feminist writing, as she's arguing for the basic equality of women. That might not sound super radical today, but as you can imagine, it was pretty radical in 1792. So she was well known, and also Mary's father was pretty well known. He was a philosopher named William Godwin, who also wrote pretty widely. So Bloom makes the point that, both of her parents were writers. So obviously, Mary Shelley was kind of born into writing, and she took to it at a very early age. But one interesting thing about her bio, her mom died really young. I don't remember exactly how old Mary was. She might have still been like in infancy. I don't recall. But her mom died young, and her father remarried. And Mary did not get along with her stepmother. And interestingly enough, she really wasn't given access to a formal education. Even though Godwin sort of believed that it was good to educate women, he didn't really have the means. They had other kids. I don't remember all the reasons, but she was kind of, and also I think she was just kind of, her stepmom was prejudiced against her, but she didn't receive a formal education. Instead, she listened because her father sort of hosted what they called back then sort of a literary salon, kind of like I don't want to call it a book club, but kind of like a writers group. If you guys have ever been a part of that, like in school, there's some other sort of groups that do that outside of academia, but it's kind of like people would get together, poets, influential thinkers, philosophers. Again, it was kind of an intellectual household. So people would come over and they would recite poetry, they would share their new work, they would review or talk about other people's work. So Mary was able to pick up a lot just by listening to some of these friends of her father who would come to the house and read some of their poetry. So famously, she heard Samuel Taylor Coleridge recite The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, a very famous poem that still gets studied today. But the legend has it as she heard Coleridge recite it like in her family's living room. She wasn't supposed to be there, but she was hiding behind a couch along with her sister, and she was able to hear this famous poem by Coleridge. And it was very influential to her. As Bloom and others point out, she was very indebted to poets like Coleridge, who was a contemporary of her husband, Percy Shelley, and they were both considered romantic poets. So perhaps you guys have heard that term, romanticism. It doesn't quite mean romantic like in the sense of like a romantic comedy, like, a couple meeting and falling in love. They did deal with, themes around love, but they weren't strictly writing like romance the way we would think about it. We call them the romantic poets because they're tapping into an older strain of what used to be called romanticism. That was kind of a literary genre that existed centuries ago. We don't have to talk about it a whole lot, but it does help to know a little bit about what they were into because Mary Shelley got into some of that stuff too. The romantic poets were very into nature. They were very interested in the emotions. You have to remember, we're in the very early 19th century here. So the Great Enlightenment, an important historical period, has kind of already happened. This is a period of great scientific breakthrough, a lot of advancements in like science, architecture, agriculture. We were developing new machines, the steam engine, all this stuff that would be really important. It kind of ties into the Industrial Revolution in some ways, but the Enlightenment is often remembered as a real flourishing of learning and science, but not just science, literature, the arts, all kinds of things really kind of came to the forefront, and people were really valuing rationality, particularly Shelley's father, William Godwin, who was a very big fan of a rational approach to life. This was different than the older, kind of more religious Some might even call it sort of superstitious approach of older times, the Middle Ages, antiquity, whatever. So anyway, the Romantic poets were kind of pushing back against rationality and saying sometimes reason, logic, scientific proofs, they don't explain everything. So they believe that the emotions, nature, the concept of the sublime, something that was kind of scary, but also filled you with awe and curiosity. You wanted to know more, but it also might destroy you. They often found that in nature. They also found that in trying to push the boundaries of knowledge, learning. They were kind of revolutionary in their style for the time period. Some people refer to them as kind of precursors of hippies in some ways. They believed in free love, but they were also champions of equality, which was pretty rare back then. People like Shelley thought, Percy Shelley thought that women more or less should have equal rights and should be held in sort of the same esteem as men. So he encouraged Mary to write and to publish like her parents had. But she ran away with Percy Shelley. That was not a popular choice amongst either of their families. So Percy Shelley was already married when they met. He fell in love with Mary, who was still a teenager. That was not terribly uncommon back then. He was a bit older, still pretty young, in his 20s. They run away, they get married, and it was kind of scandalous. His family did not approve. He came from a very wealthy, sort of aristocratic family. They're both English, of course. They both live in England. Mary Shelley's family was well known, but not as wealthy, not in the same class status as Shelley. So the Shelleys didn't approve, and Mary's father didn't approve. He didn't like Percy Shelley. He didn't want her to marry him. So they're both kind of cast off by their families, and she's very young, right? She's, I think, 18, maybe 17 or 18 when they get married, and she writes most of Frankenstein when she is 19. So pretty impressive to think that she created this classic work of literature while still a teenager, maybe close to the age of some of you guys. So she really consumed a lot of the revolution in the air, right? Like she was listening to people like Percy Shelley and Samuel Coleridge, who was a bit older, but also Lord Byron, another Romantic poet who was friends with Shelley. And they would hang out, they would talk, and she would listen. She would listen, and a lot of those ideas would later show up in her work. So legend has it, and this is actually more or less verified, the sort of story of the writing of the book. In 1816, she and Percy go to Geneva, Switzerland, which also happens to be the birthplace of the character Victor Frankenstein. So they're kind of on vacation. They're spending the summer in Geneva with friends, including Lord Byron. But apparently it rained a lot that summer. So they weren't able to go outside and do fun stuff, like on the lake. So they stayed inside and they told a lot of ghost stories. So apparently Lord Byron issued a challenge. He said everybody present should write their own ghost story and then share with everyone else, and they would determine who wrote the best one. So that's why Mary Shelley started writing this. And apparently her ghost story was the only one that was actually completed, and she later turned it into this novel. So kind of interesting. You can read more about that stuff if you want to, but a lot of her inspiration for the book came from listening to Byron and her husband talk about what they called the principle of life and the possibility of bringing a corpse back to life. She was very intrigued by that premise, by that idea, and she started to think that's kind of scary. Actually, the idea of bringing something back to life awakens what she called thrilling horror and speaks to the mysterious fears of our nature. So she became very intrigued and she wanted to do more with that. And she also uses Geneva as the setting for most of the novel. So she was very inspired by the landscape. I've never been to Switzerland myself. Maybe some of you have, but they have big mountains. The Alps are there. They have very majestic vistas, very impressive geography and landscape, which was a big deal to the Romantic poets. Again, they thought there were really important truths contained in nature that could not be explained by humans or by science or medicine. And that's the kind of attitude that Victor Frankenstein wanted to kind of transcend. He wanted to find that sort of hidden, forbidden knowledge that had previously been, inaccessible to humans. So she got intrigued by this idea. What if somebody wanted to bring a corpse back to life? What if somebody wanted to play God in that way? How could it play out? And that's really sort of the genesis, the start of the novel. So let's just talk a little bit about the structure, because if you guys are just starting this here in week 2, or if you just started it at the end of week 1, you might be a little puzzled as to what's going on in those initial letters when we're hearing about this guy, Captain Walton, and he's like at the North Pole, he's going on some expedition, and you might be wondering, where's Frankenstein? Like, where's the monster? Where's the story that I'm familiar with? So what you have to get through first is what we call a frame narrative. So this is a literary technique that basically places one story within another story. And it does this for various reasons. The outer story, the frame, can sort of provide a context for the inner story. It can also provide some linkage if we're trying to sort of put together themes or larger sort of significance. We can connect maybe these distinct tales into some kind of larger whole. But in a simple way, really just think of a frame narrative as setting up the main narrative. That's often how it features, that's often how it functions. And that's very much what we see here. Those opening letters from Walton to his sister are really just setting the stage for the first appearance of the creature and the first appearance of Victor Frankenstein. So be patient. This is how we eventually meet Victor. So we start with these 4 letters written by Robert Walton and addressed to his sister, Mrs. Seville, who's back in England. So Robert Walton doesn't play a huge role in most of the action of the novel, but he is kind of important, and Bloom and a lot of other scholars argue that he's supposed to be kind of a mirror image of Victor. If you pay attention to what Walton is saying to his sister in those early letters, you'll notice that he's got a lot in common with Victor. He wants some of the same things that Victor wants. He's not a scientist like Victor, but he's a ship captain, right? And he's going on an expedition to the Arctic. I think it's the North Pole. Yeah. And he tells his sister that, he read these stories of heroic sea voyages when he was young, and they inspired him to accomplish a great purpose by discovering the secrets in what he calls a part of the world never before visited. And that was largely true. I don't think we had really explored the North Pole yet very well in, the early 1800s. So Walton wants fame. He wants to discover new things. He wants to push the limits of what humans can do. He literally wants to do something that no one else has ever done, and something that may have even been considered impossible. So in that way, he's similar to Frankenstein. They're pushing the boundaries. They're pushing the envelope. They're ambitious, maybe too ambitious. So we're supposed to kind of notice that. Walton also tells his sister that he has this, really powerful curiosity, which is also true of Frankenstein. A good quality, but if it goes too far, it might lead you to ruin. So again, we're supposed to recognize in Walton this same kind of dangerous thirst for knowledge that we'll later see in Victor. Scientific knowledge, knowledge of new places, this idea of maybe finding the secrets of nature. It's intriguing. It's very thought-provoking to try to do those things, but It can also be dangerous. So we'll notice these parallels between Walton and Victor Frankenstein. But also, we get something else, and that's a theme, really. If we want to identify an early theme at work in the novel, this dangerous quest for knowledge. That's a very important idea that runs through the entire novel. So it's one of these bigger sort of meanings that we can definitely pull out of it as a theme. But there's another theme that runs through the book, and it has to do with loneliness and being rejected and being isolated and how damaging that can be, not just for regular humans, but also for the creature. But we first hear about loneliness from Walton. In the second letter, they haven't even left for the North Pole yet. I think he's like in Alaska or someplace. He's like getting ready to go, but he's already kind of lonely because he doesn't have any buddies with him. And you have to remember also, this is a different time period. Class mattered a lot, particularly in English society. So Walton was a pretty well-to-do guy. He's a ship captain. He comes from a pretty, affluent background. And his crew, the guys working on his ship, they would have been from mostly lower classes. So he wouldn't have really hung out with them. They wouldn't have been as educated as him, and it just wasn't really socially acceptable back then for a sort of gentleman like him to hang out with like regular sailors. He does mention that there's like a lieutenant on board, that he's pretty smart. I can sort of talk to him, but he's basically complaining to his sister, like, I don't have any friends here. I'm really lonely, right? He calls loneliness a most severe evil. And again, this is foreshadowing. Another literary technique that you guys have probably seen before. It's when we get like a hint of things that are going to happen later in the narrative. So Walton and his attitude kind of foreshadows what we're going to see in Victor Frankenstein, and also the loneliness that he feels is kind of a prediction of what's going to happen with the monster. The monster is also going to be very alone. So, but again, Walton's excited to go to these unexplored regions, and he mentions the land of snow and ice. That's a reference to Coleridge and the poem The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which, like I said, Mary Shelley heard as a kid. So by the third letter, Walton has finally started his expedition. They're finally underway. So they're in the very far north. There's icebergs everywhere. But again, Walton maintains this optimism, this ambition. He asks this rhetorical question: what can stop the determined heart of man? And his implied answer is obviously nothing. Nothing can stop me from discovering the unknown. And that's very much how Victor feels. Victor's like, why shouldn't I take my knowledge and do something that no one else has done? Why not push the boundaries? What can stop me? I want it all. So again, we notice that parallel, and we're going to see how it can be dangerous. But the real story of Frankenstein begins in the fourth letter. That's when we first see the monster, or the creature, the demon, and that's when we first meet Victor Frankenstein. So this is the fourth letter, and we're seeing all these icebergs, and things are getting pretty perilous. And eventually, Walton's crew notices an unnaturally large man on like a floating ice block, and he's being pulled on a sled by dogs. And they notice that, but then, the big figure escapes their view. He goes out of view. And then later, they see Victor floating on a different ice block. And Victor only has one dog left alive, and he's clearly not in good shape. He doesn't really have anything to eat. He's suffering from extreme fatigue and hunger. So they bring him on board. He refuses at first until they tell him, where they're going. But then they take him on board. Walton starts to talk to him because, yay, Walton has now found a buddy. Frankenstein comes from kind of the same social class as Walton, even though Frankenstein's from Switzerland and Walton is an Englishman. So Walton's like, oh, I can talk to this guy. And as Frankenstein recuperates in Walton's cabin, they start to chat. Walton starts to get kind of attached to Frankenstein. Again, remember, Walton has been very lonely, right? He's anxious to talk and learn more about Frankenstein. And Frankenstein tells him, the reason I'm out here is I was pursuing someone who fled from me. So that, of course, sparks the interest of Walton. They talk more, and eventually Frankenstein begins to tell his story. But notice how this gets set up. Walton again expresses his yearning, his quest for knowledge and discovery. And he even says, he's willing to sacrifice everything in this pursuit of knowledge and new discovery. And that's when Frankenstein's like, I used to feel that way too, but maybe you want to reconsider. So, in the hopes of saving Walton from a similar fate to his own, Frankenstein begins to share his story. But you need to remember that he's sort of offering his story as a warning, as a caution to Walton. Don't do what I did. Don't sacrifice everything for knowledge and discovery, because that's what I did. And look at me now. I'm floating on some ice block in the Arctic, and I would have died if you guys hadn't found me. So that's really the reason Frankenstein begins to share his story. He wants Walton to avoid that same kind of fate. So then, from that point on, with the exception of a few chapters, Victor is our narrator. Victor narrates the rest of the story, except for a handful of chapters where the creature is actually serving as the narrator. The creature eventually tells his story to Victor much later on, when they are sort of reunited after a long time apart. So early on, though, it's all about Victor. And the first couple of chapters, he tells about his birth, his childhood, growing up in Geneva. And we also learn about Elizabeth, who will become, the love of his life. She's adopted into the family when he's young, so he's not related to her, but she does sort of grow up with him. But she's adopted, and her parents, his parents sort of take him in and raise her as one of their own. So they're very close, Victor and Elizabeth, and they have this very strong bond. But even when they're kids, we see that Victor has this desire to uncover what's called the secrets of heaven and earth. Meanwhile, Elizabeth is a little more drawn to poetry and more safe and calm activities. But he, of course, falls in love with her, and they eventually, later on, once they're grown up, they get married. Third chapter, Victor's mom dies, and he goes off to college in Germany. So, a pretty relatable experience, and he's roughly the same age as college freshmen would be today. He's like 17 or something like that. So he goes off to school, leaving his family behind in Geneva. And in school, he resumes his sort of natural curiosity in the world of science. And he discovers that he's a very good student. I mean, he was already smart and sort of accomplished, but he continues to have success with his scientific pursuits. He gets interested in chemistry. He starts studying physiology, and he's advancing rapidly. He's learning rapidly. And he's recognized, he's celebrated by his professors and his classmates for his uncommon ability in science. So he's a very bright young guy. He's got a great future. Things are going really well for him at this point. And he gets increasingly interested in physiology, anatomy, the study of the human body, and the source of life. So that's a real concern for him, and it was a real concern of Percy Shelley and Lord Byron and some of these other people, because we didn't know as much about science and medicine back then. So there was still this kind of open question, like how, like where does the life source come from? And where exactly is it contained within the human body? We didn't fully understand all of that. Bloom talks about this famous episode. I don't remember all the details, but I want to say it was Percy Shelley or somebody else connected to Mary was arguing with this family friend. Maybe it was her father. Was arguing with this family friend who was like a surgeon. He was a medical doctor. And they had this disagreement about the source of life. And the medical doctor thought it had something to do with God or spirituality. It was some kind of ineffable substance that was kind of beyond human understanding. And that's how a lot of people still regarded issues of life and death back then. But Mary's father, who was more of a rationalist, didn't really believe in a lot of old religious ideas, was more about science, more about progress, more about the Enlightenment. He was like, no, it's all about the organs and the blood, and we can figure it out if we get into the body, but it's not something supernatural that exists outside the body. But that was still an ongoing debate, and it really still is, I would argue, to some extent today. But of course, they didn't know as much as we did. So some of the things Victor's getting into and wants to know, we actually know it now. But other things like the power to bring something back to life, those are still things that most humans agree shouldn't be done, even if the technology might exist to get that done to some extent. But anyway, Victor gets more and more interested not just in life, but also in death. So he begins to study how human bodies die and decay. So his research takes a little bit of a dark turn at this point, and he even acknowledges that at this point he should have probably stopped. Like he should have been turned off or repulsed by his research, but he's not. Instead, he's just driven even more to find an answer. And eventually he becomes convinced that he has discovered the secret of life and death, and that he has the power to create a human being and invest it with life. Something that had previously been considered either impossible or completely taboo for a human to try to do. So again, his determination for knowledge, it really has no limit. He just keeps going. And a lot of scholars today will argue that's a warning by Shelley. That's a warning that, you have to have a limit to how far you want to go with scientific advancement and knowledge. But Victor keeps working. He ignores his family. He ignores his health. And as he tells Walton, he eventually achieves his goals, but at this great cost, right? So a quote here from Victor when he's talking to the captain, he's again warning of what might happen to one that he says aspires to become greater than his nature will allow. A very important idea. One who aspires to become greater than his human nature allows. But he says at the time, my experiments, they blinded me to those dangers, and I just kept working. He begins to think that he can create a new species, a new type of creature that would bless him as their creator and source, maybe even worship him to some extent. And here we see a very common complaint about doing the sort of thing that Victor wants to do. Part of the danger of pushing science this far to the point where you can create life. Now you have too much power. Now you can be God. And now you start wanting people to regard you as their creator, their God. You want them to sort of bow down to you because you're sort of punch drunk on this power and this knowledge. So that's what's beginning to happen to Victor, as he explains. But years pass, right? 2 more years pass before he can finally finish his project. This is not something that he's able to do on a long weekend, right? But by chapter 5, the creature awakes. The creature has life. But it's funny to notice the reaction of Victor. He's been working towards this for so long, but as soon as the creature wakes up, as soon as Victor can see, quote, the dull yellow eye of the creature open, he gets scared. He gets really scared and freaked out at what he's done. He finally kind of realizes that he's gone too far and he's overcome with horror at what he has done. And he's really kind of grossed out at how the creature looks, right? He's just really disgusted. So he runs out of his apartment. He just runs away. He's like, oh, I cannot deal with this. So he flees and he wanders the streets throughout the night. He's tormented, he's frightened, and he's convinced that the creature might be following him, wanting to destroy him. So he's pretty stressed out. He eventually runs into his friend Henry, who's kind of like, hey, calm down, what's going on? But later, Victor becomes convinced that he really has seen the monster, and the monster tries to kill him. But that's just a hallucination at this point. That will kind of happen in reality later on. But at this point, in chapter 5, he's hallucinating, and he really ends up having a nervous breakdown. I mean, that's not the language they would have used back then. But scholars today recognize what happens to Victor at that point as pretty much a nervous breakdown. He's been burning the candle at both ends. He's exhausted, and he's finally realizing how terrifying his creation really is. So in chapter 6, Henry's nursing Victor back to health. And Victor wants to go back to Geneva and see his family. He's been away from them by this point for like 5 or 6 years. So he wants to go back. And then several bad things start happening to Victor, in large part because he has rejected his own creation. So between chapters 7 and 9, a lot of bad stuff is going down. And again, at first, Victor kind of thinks that it's just the creature's fault, right? This is all happening because the creature is malevolent, the creature's bad. But a more nuanced reading, a deeper level of analysis and interpretation has led some people to think that really all of these bad things are happening because of Victor, because of Victor's choices, because he abandoned his creation, because he ran away and tried to just wash his hands of the whole thing. So maybe that's the real reason that he starts to experience some tragedies. But anyway, on his way back to Geneva, he gets a letter from his father telling him that his youngest brother, William, has been murdered. So this obviously upsets Victor. He wants to get back to console his family. And once he gets home, he catches a glimpse of the creature sort of scaling some mountains. And he becomes convinced that the creature has killed his brother. And later on, we learn that that is, in fact, true. So he sees this giant, kind of running off into the mountains, and he becomes convinced that, oh no, I think I know what has happened. But the murder gets pinned on this woman, Justine, who's like a young woman living with Victor's family. Her background sounds a little bit like Elizabeth. She was an orphan. She was adopted sort of by the family, and they bring her up as one of their own. But she's later discovered with the necklace that the little boy was wearing. And she has no explanation as to how she ends up with the necklace. So she gets accused of murdering the boy. The idea is she wanted the necklace, so she killed the kid and stole the necklace. That's not what happened, but that's what the authorities are convinced happened. Elizabeth doesn't think that. Victor doesn't think that. Elizabeth even speaks on behalf of Justine at her trial, but she's still convicted. She's still found guilty and sentenced to death for the crime. So Victor is, of course, pretty upset at this point. Not only is his little brother dead, but he's also pretty convinced that Justine has been wrongfully accused and convicted of the murder. So he kind of feels like he's responsible for both of their deaths. And many readers might say, yeah, you kind of are, Victor. Maybe you should feel that way. And then in chapter 10, he tries to get away from his troubles for a while. He decides to visit some nearby mountains that he enjoyed hiking in when he was a kid. But when he's there, he's confronted for the first time by his creation, by the creature. So this is a pretty famous scene. It gets recreated in a lot of the movie adaptations. They're in this kind of majestic, mountain vista. The creature confronts Victor. It's very hostile at first in this sort of crucial confrontation, this very famous scene. At first, Victor kind of threatens the monster. He's like, you evil thing, I'm going to destroy you. He's filled with rage. He really threatens to kill the creature because of the deaths of William and Justine. And the creature is not surprised by this reaction. He has a famous quote here where the creature says, "All men hate the wretched. How then must I be hated, who am miserable beyond all living things?" So already by this point, the creature has learned a lot. We notice that the creature is very literate. The creature speaks very well. He's learned to read. He's learned various languages, or at least French. We actually observe him learning French during his little personal narration. So he's learned a lot, but he's learned also how bad humans can be, how mean, how spiteful, how violent humans can be. And he's kind of disillusioned because he starts out very innocent. He's like a newborn. He doesn't know anything when he's first created, and he's immediately abandoned by his creator. So he has to learn and experience everything alone. Again, going back to that theme of isolation, solitude, and how damaging it is really for anyone. And it's certainly damaging for him. So he already knows that people hate him. And they largely hate him because of the way he looks, his appearance. He's scary. So people get scared and people run him off or even try to kill him. So he expects this response from Victor, but he's very sad, right? He's sad and he thinks he deserves better from his creator. So he begins to plead with Victor. He says, "Remember that I am thy creature. I ought to be thy Adam, but am rather the fallen angel, whom thou drivest from joy for no misdeed." So again, I know the language is different. It can require a little bit of translation. But notice what he's saying. He's saying, you made me. You're responsible for me, right? And then he says, "I ought to be your Adam." He's talking about Adam from Adam and Eve, the first humans created by God. I ought to be your Adam. But instead, the monster says, "I am your fallen angel." So a lot of critics like Bloom see this as a reference to Paradise Lost, a famous epic poem written by the English author John Milton, which was a very influential text for Shelley. And if you remember, this happens, I think, later in the novel when we're hearing the monster story, but when he comes across some books in the woods and is able to teach himself to read, I believe one of those books is Paradise Lost. So he's comparing himself to Satan in Paradise Lost, who's cast out of heaven and becomes very bitter and resentful as a result. And the monster's saying, "Yeah, that's kind of happening to me. Like, I could have been your Adam, but you were so mean to me. Instead, I'm starting to become more like your Satan. I'm a fallen angel, and you've driven me he says, you've driven me from joy." So in other words, you've prevented me from happiness. You've prevented me from having any kind of happiness, despite the fact that I have committed no misdeed. So the creature is saying, "I didn't really do anything to deserve this, but you've been very mean to me, and as a result, things have gotten pretty bad for both of us." So after listening, Victor is finally a little bit moved by the creature's pleas, and he begins to realize that maybe he does need to do something for this creation, this thing that he has brought to life. So that brings us to the end of chapter 10. And then for the next 6 or 7 chapters, the creature becomes our narrator. He tells his story to Victor while they're still up there in the mountains. So basically, the creature is like filling Victor in on everything that's happened since Victor abandoned him. So the creature's like, yeah, let me tell you how it's been for me. Let me tell you what it's like for a gigantic, sort of disfigured, ghastly, monster looking guy with no friends, no family, no teachers, no institutions to help me, to shelter me. Let me tell you how it's been for me since I've been all alone. So this begins in chapter 11, and he's telling us kind of his early days, how he learns about the world. So once he leaves the laboratory, he kind of wanders out into the woods. He's able to find some food and water. And over the next few days, he kind of learns about the sun and the moon and the sort of, passage of days. And eventually he discovers a shepherd's hut. And he just kind of walks in, not realizing that that might not be a great idea. Not surprisingly, the old man who lives there runs away immediately after he sees the monster. He's terrified. But the creature's able to get some food. He's able to stay there for a while. And then he wanders into the nearby village, where again, he's innocent. He doesn't realize that people are going to be afraid of him. He just wants some company. He wants to hang out. He wants to learn. He wants to be sort of taken in. But instead, all of the villagers are horrified. They chase him away. And this keeps happening to him, right? He's looking for some connection. He's looking for a human connection, but he keeps getting rejected because of his appearance and his huge stature. Everybody's afraid of him. But eventually he finds another cottage where a French family is living. And he's able to kind of listen to them and sort of hear them talk. He's able to kind of, there's like an opening like in the wall where he's able to kind of listen and observe them. And this is very important for him. This is an important learning moment for the creature because he has never before been exposed to human love or compassion, warmth, understanding. And this family is very loving. So by observing them, he kind of learns what it is to be good to each other, to be kind to one another, to express love and affection. He's never experienced that. So he's pretty excited about it. He's like, oh, this can happen for me. I can be with people like this who care about me and they're kind to me. So he decides, okay, I'm going to try to sort of see if I can join this family or sort of, join their group. So he goes and approaches the old man who's blind. And he tries to kind of explain his situation to the old man, but also he kind of learns how to speak French by listening to the family because the fiance of the son of the old man is from Turkey. So she's learning French. That allows the creature to also learn French. So now he can talk, he can communicate. So he talks to the old man. It's like, look, I've had a rough go of it. Anything you could do to kind of help me out. And the old man is sympathetic, but then his kids show up. And his kids, just like everybody else, they're scared of the monster. The old man can't see the monster, so the old man's willing to give him a chance. But the kids are horrified. They chase the creature, and then later he discovers that the whole family has left. The whole DeLacy family has moved away, undoubtedly because they're afraid of him. So this is where we see kind of a turn in the monster, in the creature. He gets really angry at this point. Now, I think he's already discovered the books. I think he read the books out in the woods already by this point. So he's learned a lot. He's learned about human suffering and cruelty. He's learned that also from experience, but he's becoming literate. He's learning by reading and acquiring language. But then the family leaves and he is pissed. He's angry. So he burns down the hut or, their cottage after they're gone. And he begins to really feel the injustice of it all, right? It's not fair. It's not right. All he wants is what everybody wants. And he keeps getting denied. He feels like he'll never have another chance to be accepted and loved. So those negative feelings start to motivate more negative, destructive behavior in the creature. Before, he was innocent. He was gentle. He didn't really want to hurt anybody. But now he's increasingly angry. He feels like he's getting a raw deal, so he starts acting out. And he wants revenge on Victor. He obviously wants revenge on his creator, so he becomes determined to find Victor. So he's explaining all of this over the course of his own narration. So eventually, the creature makes his way to Geneva to try to confront Victor. But instead, he comes across, well, first, he comes across the young kid, the little boy. They get into kind of an argument. At first, the monster or the creature thinks that the kid might be nice to him because he's learned that young children are typically more innocent and more kind than grown-ups. But the boy's kind of mean to him. The boy's like threatening him. My dad's going to be mad if you mess with me. So the boy also becomes scared once again of the creature, starts to make a lot of noise. The creature wants to quiet him down, but also the creature comes to learn through their interaction that this boy is a member of the Frankenstein family. So the creature says, "You belong to my enemy." And he then kills the little guy, strangles him. And then takes the necklace and plants it on Justine while she's asleep, so she'll get blamed for the murder. So it can be kind of hard to remain sympathetic at this point to the monster because he's doing some pretty monstrous things. But many readers and many critics will argue that he's been driven to these behaviors by Victor. So that's kind of the end of the creature's narration. He wraps up his tale by the end of chapter 16. And then he demands that Victor create another being like him. He wants a mate. He's lonely, right? The creature is lonely. So he concludes his narration by telling Victor, look, the least you can do for me is to create another being that looks like me, right? So we can be together and we can sort of have our own life separate from humans. So in chapter 17, the two of them, Victor and the creature, kind of argue and they eventually negotiate a deal. This is important to kind of keep in mind. We'll stop here at the end of chapter 17. They come up with a deal. The creature will stay away from people and never show himself if Victor will make a mate for the creature, so the creature doesn't have to be alone. So that's kind of where we can stop for now, and we can wrap up the rest of the narrative next week. So that takes us about 3/4 of the way through the novel. So hopefully me walking through these chapters will be helpful, but I still want you guys to try to read the book yourself. You can consult some online sources. You can use these lectures to help you. But try to struggle through the book yourself, even if you're not understanding everything, even if some of the language mystifies you, or if you have some questions, that's fine. Just put in the effort, and we'll try to wrap up our reading by next week. So like I said, by week 3, let's wrap up Frankenstein, and we'll also talk about To His Coy Mistress, the other required work of literature that I want you guys to tackle before we get back to the textbook. All right? So let me know if you have any questions, and otherwise I will see you next week for the week 3 lecture.